So what I want to do is give you an introduction to landscape finance. And we've got a whole set of challenges hitting us. COVID, obviously, and the recession that will come from that, which hasn't quite caught up with us yet. But much bigger than that is climate change, and then biodiversity collapse is really coming down the line, and we don't even begin to understand how much that's going to change our lives, but it will. And what the conservation world is starting to realize is that the tools we have at the moment are wrong. They're far too small, far too short term, and not able to integrate action together. So that's why we're moving into the landscape approach. Next slide, please. And also into finance, commercial finance and the landscapes together. Next slide. So what is the landscape approach? I think there's a bit of a delay. Yeah, so the landscape approach is interesting because it allows you to think much longer term. So really deal with those later waves that are coming down the line. It allows you to think over many different sectors at the same time. So if you look at this picture, a landscape approach allows you to work on agriculture, on water, on urban spaces, on forestry, and so on. And you can do it all together. And what we're finding as we do that is that there are ways of creating synergies between different sectors that don't normally talk to each other, can help each other to solve much larger problems. And of course, it is a much larger impact if you're working at that sort of scale. Next slide, please. Back in 2015, we launched this book up on the top right, the Little Sustainable Landscapes book. This was a collaboration of 15 different organizations. We launched it at the Paris COP, the climate convention. And as we were writing it, what we found is that most sectors had some form of a landscape approach. In the forestry world, it's plantation landscapes or deforestation-free landscapes. In agriculture, climate-smart agriculture was starting to develop. Integrated catchment management in the water world is the standard way of operating. It just makes very good sense. Coastal zone management and so on. So what we've done in putting this book together is look at how to find where the commonalities are between those different worlds. And we've proposed a single approach that works for all of them. It's just a 5-step approach that allows people to go through the steps to build their own landscape program. And you do a landscape program because it's the largest scale at which you can get real results. At the national scale, you can define laws and so on, but it's very hard to actually achieve results unless you go down to project scale. But at project scale, you're not working at the scale of nature. So the landscape scale allows you to deal at that level of the scale at which nature works, but also it has a benefit that it allows us to access much larger scales of finance. Next slide, please. And I think there's a lot of talk about nature-based solutions at the moment. I'm not convinced by them unless they operate within a landscape scale. So project-based investment is small scale, it's short term, it tends to work by sectors, and it tends to be competitive. It's not true that the more nature-based solutions you have in a landscape, the better off nature is. You can crowd out nature with too many nature-based solutions. Working at a landscape level allows you to bring the ecosystem to think in the way that the ecosystem operates, to think over a longer period of time, to integrate different sectors so that they're not stressing each other and the system as a whole, and create synergies. Next slide, please. And This diagram is from the book. It has the 5 steps in the landscape approach. I'll go into that at the moment. But if you go through those steps, you're going through integrated landscape management. That's the process. The result at the end of it is a sustainable landscape. It's a landscape that has clearly defined SDG goals that are agreed by the partners, by the stakeholders in the landscape, and then a plan for meeting those. And if enough landscapes go through this process, you meet the SDGs and the climate goals. That's the theory. There's perhaps 1,000 landscapes on the planet. We probably only need to address 100 of them, get 100 of them to be sustainable landscapes, because only about 100 of them contain most of the carbon emissions, most of the fresh water, most of the poverty, most of the food production. It's and there's a lot of overlap between them. It's a very interesting thing. I think there's an important paper to be written on that one. Next slide, please. So, and this is the landscape approach, the 5 elements. So you start with a multi-stakeholder platform. You bring all of the players together and agree on what the problem is and what the area is that you're working on. You reach a shared understanding about the landscape, but perhaps even more importantly about each other. It's really important to understand the motivations of each of the players within a landscape so that you can find common solutions. If you don't understand each other, that becomes very hard. Collaborative planning, so developing an overall vision, an action plan, and some sort of spatial plan is critical. And then effective implementation and financing is part of that, getting the finance to actually make it work. And monitoring and learning. This is really very simple. It's just the project cycle, but with one difference, that you start with a multi-stakeholder platform. You start with bringing all the stakeholders together and then going through project planning, rather than doing a plan and bringing it to the stakeholders. Very different results when you do that process. Next slide. So landscape finance, how does that fit into this picture? So traditionally, conservation organisations have worked in the piggy bank approach, and I think agriculture to some extent as well. Grant-based financing. How do we move to commercial financing, carbon financing, and other types of instruments? Next slide. This is a picture of the amount of money that flows around the world. There's about $200 trillion of finance flying around the planet every year. And the paradox is that nature conservation is down in those little red boxes down the bottom right. And global ODA is only 0.2 of $1 trillion, and it's dropping. Foundations are $1 trillion, less than $1 trillion. So if we really want to address the triple challenges of biodiversity loss, climate change, and overconsumption, it's in this top left area that we want to be focusing. This is where the money is. This is what we have to get down into the landscapes. But how to do that? Next slide, please. So green bonds are an interesting example. Bonds are just groups of loans. So you just group them all together. If you've got lots of house loans, you can have a bond on the house loans, or water projects. You group them together and you can have a water bond. When the green bonds first started to appear in 2012, 10 years ago, there was only $2 billion worth of them. Today, it's more than $1 trillion worth of green bonds out there, and roughly more than $200 billion per year are being issued. And that's all money that can be invested in climate smart agriculture, in better forestry, in all sorts of things. Traditionally, most of the money has gone into energy, transport, and buildings. This bottom half of the circle, and only about 3% of green bonds have been developed for the land sector. for agriculture, water, and forestry. That's really starting to change now. And so there's a lot of bankers out there, and particularly with some of the new innovations in carbon financing, there's a lot of bankers out there looking for projects. So it's a good time to be starting to get financially literate. Next slide, please. So what does $100 million project look like? That's really the scale that the bankers are looking for. Well, one thing is, don't try and get all of your money, all of your 100 million from the one source. There's public money that can incentivize, that can kick off the beginning of a program. There's private money that will invest in some of the commercial activities, and then there's impact finance that will help the riskier projects that are really making the bigger change. So blending these different pieces together is part of the process. Next slide, please. And what does it look like? Here's a couple of different types of examples. So on the left-hand side is a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is still, I think, the largest forest carbon project in the world. I helped design it over the last 10 years. It covers an area about the size of Greece, 13 million hectares. It's reducing emissions equivalent to the city of Cape Town, and it's one of 6 planned projects across DRC. If all of them happen, then you really address all of the carbon emissions from that part of the Congo. But importantly, it's investing in 15 different organizations who are doing many different things, and a whole lot of community members who are allowing their forests to grow back or changing their firing practices and so on. What isn't happening there, so that's $170 million of investment. That's an enormous amount of money going down into a very poor area. What isn't happening is commercial, using that money to trigger commercial investment. And when we set up the Landscape Finance Lab, we did our first test case in Indonesia, in Sumatra. And the result, we can't take too much credit for this, but the result, this is the slide on the right-hand side of the slide. Result is this tropical landscape finance facility in Jambi. So the problem was that Michelin Tire Company was buying from an 80,000 hectare rubber concession in this area. Just north of it is a very thin strip of forest which contains elephants, orangutans, and tigers. It's one of the 13 places on Earth where you find tigers. And if it gets broken, you lose all of those species. So it's critical to maintain it. Michelin wanted to develop wildlife-friendly rubber and also help protect the region. So we put together a program that allowed them to transition their rubber, to invest in forest restoration concessions on the side of that, and also to invest in the national park, and help smallholder farmers produce rubber and other things on their farms. Now that's become a $215 million commercial bond. It's quite extraordinary. And the reason that Michelin is doing that is because the price of money is cheaper when you're doing this sort of sustainable project compared to a normal project. There's much more appetite for growing appetite for commercial sustainability projects. That's increasing. Next slide, please. But can you do that with small businesses? That's with big businesses. So in Fiji, we took on a program to help save the reefs of Fiji. They're being destroyed by land-based runoffs, and climate change will make it even worse. But if we can get rid of the pollution, the pesticides, the fertilizers, the waste that's going into the seas, it'll make a big difference to their ability to survive. And there we've done two things in building the Great Sea Reef Resilience Program. So one is to create a public investment program. There's a Green Climate Fund proposal for $30 million to set up a Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority type arrangement for the reefs. It'll be very different, but it'll look after the governance, the monitoring, and some incentives for public and private actors. But then parallel to that is this organisation called Matanataki that has been set up, which helps green businesses to get investment so that they can support the program to save the reefs. Now, Matanataki they'll be presenting next week at the UN General Assembly. They've done remarkable work. They represent 50 different stakeholders. They've worked with 120 businesses. They've got 10 now investment ready, and the first of them a waste. They've bought a waste dump, and they're turning it into a recycling centres, and that has a $12 million investment. It's a really exciting example of what's possible when you work with a whole lot of business stakeholders in a landscape, and community stakeholders obviously as well, to create solutions at landscape scale. Next slide, please. And paradoxically, we've been hired by the government of Ireland and the European Investment Bank to think about the same sort of thing for the peatlands of Ireland. Now, peat and boglands cover 20% of Ireland, about 1.4 million hectares, and they're not very well managed by and large. At the moment, they emit about 3 million tonnes of carbon, and that's not counted in Ireland's peatland carbon accounting system. It will be counted from this year onwards because the Greens have got into government and they've made sure of that. So that'll jump the peatland, sorry, I'm stuck on the word peatland, the carbon account for the country by 5%. It'll jump it up by 5%. But what we've worked out is that it's possible, if you protect peatlands, to reduce the carbon budget of Ireland by 10%, to save 6 to 10 million tonnes of carbon per year by better managing the peatlands. And it doesn't look like it's that difficult to do that. There's 3 state agencies that own more than nearly 400,000 hectares of peatland. That's the energy company, Bord na Móna, that was burning peatland for energy, crazy. So they've now stopped that, state forestry and national parks. And then there's more than 200,000, probably close to 400,000 that's owned by farmers, small farming communities. So we're working out a solution for each of these different stakeholders and setting up a national system of carbon payment that will pay each of them to protect peatlands. What's exciting is that money, I hope, will be able to go into creating businesses that will keep on generating benefits for peatlands and for local communities. So we're just into finishing the first stage of this. It's a loan from it's a grant from the European Investment Bank. They'll then put 10 million euro on the table to do a set of test investments and design the overall system. And we expect this to be able to create carbon and other investments of tens of millions of euro per year. Next slide, please. So the theory of landscape program development is this. At the landscape level, at the top level, so if you go up with the pointer, yep, thank you. At that level, you bring the stakeholders together and you set an overall goal. What's the problem you want to solve, and what's the solution that you think you can create? Next level down, you think of what are the pieces you need to put into place to make that happen, the 3 components. In the case of Ireland, it's forest management, so removing forests off peatland and letting the peat grow back. That saves more carbon. Peat restoration, creating protected areas. There could be other components in there as well. Then you go looking for activities that can actually achieve those component goals. So they might be investable, they might be business activities that produce a return on income, timber production, for instance, or carbon programs, or they might need to be funded by grant funding. So, that's what's called enabling funding. So the light green here are all grant-funded activities. The darker green are possible income-generating activities. And it's the mix of those that allows you to create a program that really can deliver on the SDGs in a landscape, that can deliver on better water supply, on carbon outcomes, on community livelihoods, and so on. And that's the basic theory of building a landscape program. Next slide. And just to finish off, I'll give you a picture of a project we're just starting to work on in Scotland. We've done the first phase of this. This is in the very north of the country. Next slide, please. It's an exciting area because Scotland has committed itself to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. And they've really taken on a landscape approach. These regional spatial strategies see the potential to turn each landscape in Scotland into something much more exciting, much more green, much more vibrant. And you can see from those two pictures, there, the way that they're envisaging Scotland. Next slide. And this area up in the very northeast of Scotland, the flow country, is where we're starting the experiment. So this is 400,000 hectares of peatland again. It's the largest blanket bog in Europe. Very important for bird life, salmon rivers, a lot of interesting plants only found there, and so on. And it'll be World Heritage listed very soon. But what's interesting about it is that this one area contains twice the carbon content of all of the woodlands and forests of the United Kingdom combined. So it's critical to protect this area. It's pretty well managed, but with climate change, it's going to start losing carbon rapidly. And that's the challenge, is to build a program that keeps it alive, keeps the water running, and so on. Next slide. You can see just some pictures of the landscape. Next slide. And I won't go into the details, but we've had a whole set of stakeholders coming together to start designing this. We'll go into much more detail, looking at the business opportunities over the next couple of months. Next slide, please. We have an overall vision, which is a multi-use landscape where healthy and restored peatlands support global biodiversity and climate protection and creates high quality jobs. Next slide. We'll skip that one. And there's 3 programs that are being designed. One is a community-based carbon program across the landscape. 2, a flow country branding. It's called this area, as it becomes World Heritage, will really get known a lot more internationally, get a lot more tourists, and there's potential for a lot more investment. So building a brand for the area, and then investing some of those carbon money and other investment money in green businesses in the region. Next slide, please. So let me stop there and see if there's any questions.